to conduct of ops and communications. As I get that set up, did anybody have any questions over the GERT? Did everyone take this for GERT and do okay?
I haven't taken the quiz yet, but I need to. This weekend was kind of insane. We got the windstorm that knocked out my power and all that.
Yeah, it blew my greenhouse apart. It was intense.
Oh boy.
Okay. So let's grab this ConOps and Communications PowerPoint, and I'm going to share this. We will start talking about that. Okay. So, like I mentioned, conduct of operations is closely connected to human performance. And so we're going to talk about some of the mistakes we make and how we avoid them. And then we're going to talk just briefly about emergency communications and communication equipment. Okay. All of us depend on verbal communication for the exchange of information. It's what we're doing right now, right? I'm lecturing you so that you get more information than you might have, or slightly different information than you might have from the reading, right? Depending on the job, an individual may be responsible for transmitting or receiving information. And this could be operating instructions, feedback, reports of operational data, emergency warnings, or a myriad of other information associated with nuclear power plant operations. And whether we're talking about face-to-face or electronic through a radio, when we have information that is important to our operational function, we have to have a way to ensure that that information is transmitted and received, that it is accurate and complete, and most importantly, that it is actually understood, and what we meant to communicate is what is understood. Because people can understand things, but it maybe is not what we meant to communicate, right? And so we have to make sure that that understanding is actually correct, what we were trying to transmit. When we're talking about verbal instructions, there's 3 C's that we all need to try to be hitting, which is clear, concise, and correct. So when you're going to give directions, say that you are the procedure reader and you have to ensure that the operator that you're working with is doing the steps outlined in a step-by-step procedure that requires you to do them in order written down, in exactly the way written down. That instruction should come across very specific and free from any ambiguity. The second years in their conduct of ops class just did an exercise that was one of the best illustrations of this because they all got to experience it. So they were in the rad mock-up area, and the simulated exercise was that they were entering a very high radiation area, a high radiation area, and they had to check a reading and then communicate that back to the person who was keeping the log and had the instructions, because they couldn't bring those materials into the radiation area with them. And so the teammate was in another room with the radio, and they needed to verify valve lineups on one of the little piping systems we have on the table in the corner. Well, in addition to having those piping systems with valves on the table in the corner, there's also a series of valves hanging off the back of our whiteboard, which is actually our temporary shielding, right? And so every single one of them walked in and immediately looked at the panel that was hanging on the back of that temporary shielding and said, oh, the ball valve is open. In the procedure, they were supposed to check the position of valve 1, 2, and 3, which have taped labels on the table. And because the person who was giving them the instructions didn't say, you need to find valve 1, they all went to the wrong valve. So this is why in a nuclear power plant, in a radiological facility, in a non-reactor nuclear facility, wherever we're working, they're going to have a component labeling scheme. They're going to have labels with valve numbers and descriptors right on them so that you can specifically say, I want you to verify the position of valve 3 in the reactor coolant demon system in the second basement, right? That's specific. That tells us exactly what valve, where it is, and what system it's connected to. So I can tell you if that valve is open or closed or throttled, right? Now, we want to do all of that as briefly as possible. It took me a long time to explain to you essentially that because they weren't specific, the second years went to the wrong valve. It would be very difficult for me to have communicated that over a radio, for example, right? So before you speak, not only do you need to make sure that you're being very specific, you also need to ensure that you're giving that information in as concise a form as possible. You also need to make sure that it's correct, that the information is true and accurate. So don't say something and then be, oh, wait, never mind. Or don't start to read and instruct and then say, oh, that's not right. Make sure before you start communication that your conduct of operations is that you're going to be formal, clear, concise, and correct, and that you have what you're going to say and how you're going to say it, and you verified that that is the correct thing to say before you even initiate communication. You're going to plan what you have to say, and I recommend that you say it to yourself to ensure that it has all of those message attributes that we need. It's especially difficult when you're using a radio if you have to change what you said, because it's an extra pause. People don't like to talk on phones anymore, right? That's kind of a cultural shift because it's awkward. You have no idea when the other person is going to speak. You have to wait. Sometimes you speak over each other. It's even worse when you use a radio and it's also staticky, and by depressing the button to speak, you can actually cut the other person off before they were done and not hear that they were trying to speak. So make sure that you know what you're going to say so that you only have to say it once. Okay? This process of double checking yourself, planning what you're going to say, applying the 3 C's, this is formality in operations. And this is the kind of work structure that we should strive for in the nuclear industry. And some people don't like the additional burden to completing work that conduct of operations and some of the bureaucratic systems associated with it, like work orders and radiation work permits, bring to the nuclear industry. And, I'll be very honest, if that's something that frustrates you, if getting the task done is very important to you instead of how the task is done is more important than actually getting it done, you'll be very frustrated in the nuclear industry because there will be times that we may be technically able to do work and know how to do that work, but because the approval paperwork was not done correctly and we haven't been certain that the right engineer looked at the system change and approved it, we may not do that work. And sometimes this is bad, right? We don't want work to be stopped by unnecessary processes. But the public has no tolerance for risk in the nuclear industry. There is a lot of misunderstanding as far as the dangers of radiation. And so when we have even a very minor incident that would probably not even raise to the level of public notice in, say, a coal plant or a natural gas plant, it gets scrutinized in the nuclear industry. And that risk of lack of risk tolerance that the public has drives the cost of building and operating nuclear plants up. So one of the ways that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and Department of Energy have stated we're going to avoid that increase in risk is we're going to have this very set way of doing things that ensures that nothing is done that's uncontrolled. And even though it may seem like a large burden in order to do something that might be in other places very simple, right? It might be very simple to solder a wiring connection that's come loose on a panel in a gas-powered plant or a coal-fired plant. But a nuclear power plant, it might take you an extra day to get approval to take that material into a radiological area, to reconnect that wire in that way, and to put in compensatory measures while you take that system out of service, while you do the repair. And some people find this very frustrating. So just as you guys are first semester, and if it sounds like that kind of work environment will drive you crazy, the Nuke Ops path may not be for you, because this will be the standard in your industry, and you will not be good operators who excel and move forward in your career if you don't buy into the idea that we need to work in this way because of the industry we're in. And it needs to be something that we all support and want to do the correct way, rather than just finding a way to get something done quickly. Formality in our operations, whether it's communications or it's the paperwork or it's how and why we work, it is a really fundamental and important part of the industry that does frustrate some people. So just something for you guys to know and be able to look at yourselves and say, hey, well, I enjoy this kind of work environment. Okay. So when we're talking about communication specifically, the technique we use is called three-way communications. You'll use this when you are operating or altering facility equipment. You'll use three-way communications when you report the condition of facility equipment. If you are reporting the value of an important parameter, whenever you are reading performance of steps or actions from a procedure, and any task assignments that impact the safety of equipment, activities, or personnel. And you'll use this whether you're speaking face-to-face, on telephone, or via a radio. And we're gonna real quick watch a video of what this looks like. Can everyone see the YouTube video? Is that showing?
Hey, Control Center, this is BJ Hartfield, Hattiesburg Transmission.
The verbal exchange of information is the most frequent form of communication. However, verbal communication possesses a great risk of misunderstanding. Understanding communication can be critical.
When y'all get ready, I'm ready for y'all to come open, split the loop at 3751.
Okay, DJ, I'm going to answer 3751. I'd like you to check that on 3751. Uncouple, rocket, and open position, please.
Use three-part communication to verify that the communication was heard and understood. Do not assume that the other party hears what you said correctly. How to use three-part communication. Send the message. The sender provides clear and concise direction and/or information. Acknowledgement. The receiver repeats the message to the sender. If the message is direction, it is repeated verbatim. If general information, the message may be paraphrased. Confirmation of acknowledgement. The sender confirms that the receiver understands the correct message by affirming the acknowledgement, typically by responding, "That's correct." The phonetic alphabet is used when verbally communicating all alpha or alphanumeric designations.
All right, today we're going to roll bank one lockout. We need to isolate.
The weakest link of a communication is often the third leg, because the sender may assume the receiver heard the message, if not confirmed or corrected by the sender by means of the third leg.
Open up bank one diff cutout, and then we'll be ready to go around the back side of the panel and check for voltages and open links to complete the testing process.
Why use three-part communication? To provide for the accurate, concise, clear, and mistake-free transfer of information. To ensure that the message intended is the message received. To minimize the potential for making mistakes.
I have voltage.
All right, understanding of voltage, and I also need you to check on 22 and 28.
All right, 22 and 28. I have voltage.
Okay, I understand you have voltage.
When to use three-part communication. Three-part communication shall be used for all information exchanges that will result in decision-making, direction being given, or actions being taken related to communicating an important condition or parameter, operating or testing equipment, communicating instructions, and/or directing specific departmental guidance.
12 and 18.
12 and
Avoid these at-risk practices. Not verifying any part of the three-way communication chain. Either the sender or receiver should demand repeat back or acknowledgement if not provided by the other parties in the communication. Not verifying understanding by asking clarifying and confirming questions. Not using the phonetic alphabet when communicating all alpha or alphanumeric designations. Not listening actively. Being an active listener requires listening to not only what is being said, but also how it is said.
All right, we've agreed that we've got all the trips isolated from 9912 and 9916. I'm going to enable the bank 1 diff cutout, and we're going to proceed and roll the bank 1 lockout.
all right, roll and lockout.
All right, we rolled the lockout, and we still have indication that 9912 is closed, as well as 9916. Our test is complete.
Okay. So, in that video, that is actual training that Mississippi Power provides to its operators, and a lot of the concepts are the same as my slides, not because I took from that video, but because we both took from the Department of Energy's Conduct of Operations Handbook. So you guys are going to hear all of those things multiple times over this degree and as you get into the industry. And a lot of times, this familiarization with three-way communications, you're going to find is such a driving factor that a lot of times, even if people have less nuclear technology knowledge, but they have previous military experience where conduct of operations is practiced in the workplace, they might get preferential treatment for getting hired for a job. You will find this if where you want to work is the INL, you'll find that the favorite operator to be hired is a former Navy nuke, because they have both the nuclear technology and that conduct of operations experience. So making sure that you guys understand and apply conduct of operations in a very professional manner is going to be extremely important, especially through your initial hiring process, showing that you understand this and can apply this. Because it's very important to the people who are hiring in the nuclear industry. So that video actually, I think, gives us not great examples of three-way communication. So I'm going to point out a couple of the errors that they made. So one of the things they did repeatedly is they would state an instruction and then perform the action before the person they were communicating with confirmed. So what I would have preferred to see, especially in a training video, is that person 1, says that we're going to verify the voltage reading from 32 alpha and 18 bravo, whatever the relays were. And then the person with those relay voltage instruments would have said, confirming that I'm going to take a reading from 18 bravo. And then the first person would have said, correct. Then they could touch the relay and take that reading. That doesn't seem like a big deal in that particular application because taking your reading is not very difficult. But if this was, I'm going to close check valve 8A, 8 alpha, and that check valve affects coolant flow or affects hydraulic flow to control rod drives or any safety system like that, and you take that action before getting the confirmation, you may have received information in error, and now you've made a change to the plant that's going to cause a scram or a shutdown or release fluid that's radioactive into an area that you've been holding it back so you could go replace or do a repair. And now you have to flush that system and let it cool down a certain amount of time again, and you've lost time in your outage, which for a commercial nuclear power plant, even though our primary focus is safety, it's also not good business to not be able to produce power when you are a utility company, right? And so there is a pressure to ensure the reactor is up and running when it needs to be. So it's a good video to give you the concept, but I thought that there were a couple of little errors. So we're going to talk about the actual method we should use. And in the lab on Tuesday, Christy has kind of a puzzle game where you guys will be, one person will be in the room with the puzzle with a radio, one person will be in another room, and you guys have to give each other instructions to solve it using three-way communication. So it'll be kind of a fun way to start using this. When you do three-way communication, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to establish communication. Whether you are walking into a control room to deliver an important parameter or you are establishing your radio communications, you need to start by essentially stating who you are and what you're doing and make sure that the communications are working, right? That you've been heard, that the radio is working. So typically, you know, you've all seen the check, check, radio check type of thing. I prefer, honestly, to just say, this is operator Gorham, radio check, right? Because then they know who's communicating, because you could accidentally be on the wrong channel, right? And if you're not the person who is assigned in a team to be working and you just say radio check, they don't necessarily know that you're the correct member of their team. And you could be giving instructions to the wrong group. And so that's a great way to make sure that you're on the right channel, talking to the people you need to be, and that they can hear you. That person is going to respond back that you're communicating to, the receiver, that they have received your communication, and they're usually going to say check. And then it's them asking you to confirm that you then heard them. From there, you're going to transmit your message. So instructions are to close valve 13 Bravo and wait for low flow alarm. The receiver is going to then need to repeat that message. And like we said, if it's instructions, it should be verbatim. If it's general information, it can be paraphrased. I think that that's a little bit old, a little bit outdated now. A lot of times what is preferred is that you say it in your own words. So you're not paraphrasing and you're not repeating it verbatim, but you're communicating that you understood. So if I said, you know, close valve 8 alpha and wait for low flow alarm, you would then repeat back, you know, I understand that I will close valve 8 alpha and confirm receipt of low flow alarm, right? That's stating what you're going to do, and it's made sure that you've heard it, processed it, and can repeat it back in your own words, because sometimes just repeating verbatim doesn't necessarily mean that you understood, right? We can all mimic, 3-year-olds can mimic what's said, and they don't understand what's being said, right? After you receive the repeat back, you're then going to confirm. You can just say correct, that is correct, or you can repeat it again, confirm closing valve 8 alpha. But making sure that you do actually close the loop on the 3-way communication. When the training video said that third leg is where people fall short, that is very true. And just because you've communicated something doesn't mean you can stop listening to the repeat back. You have to actually listen and make sure what they're saying is correct and then confirm that it was. Okay. Use titles and verify that the receiver is ready for information. So, we talked about this is Operator Gorham, communications check. Before you start moving into the transmit message portion, when you're still in the established communication portion, check that the person is ready. Communication check is complete. Are you ready to perform the task? Ask them. So when you guys do your little puzzle game in lab with the three-way communications, this is Operator Johnston, and I'm checking that you can receive this message. The receiver says, I'm verifying that I can receive that. And you're going to say, to proceed with instructions. It is a great way to do this little exchange. When you transmit the message, make sure it's clear, concise, and correct. Messages that contain words with multiple meanings can be confusing. So increase and decrease, you might do a lot of things to increase or decrease, but raise and lower, you're going to do very specific things, right? So even though raising something might increase flow, raise and lower are very specific actions that you take, whereas increase and decrease, you could raise something, you could turn a nozzle, you could dethrottle something. There's a lot of ways to increase and decrease. So be specific. And then always use equipment noun names and equipment numbers. Feed water pump discharge valve 16. Formal communications does not use slang or expletives. I'll be honest, I don't think I've ever been on a radio call that hasn't used both. It's common in the workplace, but understand that it is not the standard and it's not correct. Restate equipment-related information exactly as spoken by the sender. So if you get this message of open feed water pump discharge valve 16, you need to say that part exactly because that is the proper noun of that equipment, okay? If you don't understand, ask for clarification, ask for confirmation, ask them to repeat. It is hard to hear sometimes what's on the radio and you can just not have gotten the message. So never be afraid to ask for a repetition. And then of course, confirm it. These all to you guys. We'll get plenty of practice with these at-risk practices, but these are the things that can go wrong. A big one is stating too much information or multiple actions in one message. And I think you guys will see when you do our little exercise in conduct of ops and communication that it's really hard when multiple steps come through, but it's also very frustrating when the steps are easy to have to wait step by step. So there can be both sides of that at work, but make sure you don't overload the receiver with too much information at once. Emergency communications are a very important part of formal communications. There's going to be a public address system that will make emergency announcements. And there can be alternatives, but basically every nuclear facility I've ever been at has a public address system. And there are NRC and DOE regulations that indicate how often you have to test that, ways you have to ensure that it's working. It has to be a reliable form of communication, okay? And then one of the things that's really important when you have a control area is that the emergency communication system should allow personnel from any point in the facility to reach the control area. So if you have a phone system for your facility, in an emergency, you need to be able to reach the control room, and there needs to be a way for the control room to receive multiple calls coming in. So usually that's done with direct telephone communication lines. And so there's phones that essentially you pick it up and it just goes directly without you even dialing right to the control room. And again, there's regulations that define how we use those, how they're described in the emergency plan and our emergency operating procedures. All of these are accepted forms of communications equipment. It is a little bit dated in that pagers are kind of uncommon now. But new regulations have had to evolve as data network connected devices have become more and more common. And how we interact via phone is actually of concern during an emergency situation, because if you rely on cellular phones and you have a weather-related incident that knocks out cell towers, your main mode of communication is now unreliable. So making sure that you have multiple types of communication systems that can be redundant if one goes out is really important. So that's our discussion on communications and conduct of ops. In Moodle, there is a little phonetic alphabet posted. I suggest that you get familiar with that. There's a couple different types. This is the current military one. You might see other phonetic alphabets that have other letters. I often see zebra instead of Zuzu for the Z in different ones, and they're all acceptable. Where you work will either tell you which one, or you can use basically any of the ones that exist because they all have a unique word associated with that letter that's not easily misheard. But it would be very helpful for you on Tuesday if you have some familiarity with this. If you don't want to memorize it, maybe print it out and have it with you for lab. Any questions?
I actually do have a question about the lab write-up for this past lab that we just did.
Okay.
I went on Moodle and it said to answer questions from a PDF that you had on there, and we didn't go over anything that would allow us to be able to answer those questions.
Okay. Sorry. I had to create a slightly different assignment for the people who were online. And I actually ended up having them watch a video rather than read instructions. And so I think that is leftover instructions from that. Oh, nope. Here we go. So let me share my screen. So right here as this lab report, here are the PDF questions for you guys. So if you open this, and I don't know if Christy gave you guys a evaluation and talked about the points you could get for how you did this. Okay, that's okay. She was covering it kind of the last minute for me since I had to isolate suddenly. So essentially, instead of talking about points, just, why is it good practice for having controls on what items can be put in the bag? I guess I'll probably have to change this if she didn't do a point system. So there are questions. I will change them, but that PDF is right underneath the lab assignment in Moodle. Sorry, that just needs to be updated since I wasn't there and Christy did it just a little different. Does that answer your question, Karina?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay, I'll get that updated right after this class. So as soon as, probably give me 20 minutes and then you'll have a different set of questions. Any other questions?
So along with those questions that you're going to write up, we're going to have to do kind of a write up what we did last week as well, right? Like when we practice donning and doffing the PPE, like our struggles and things like that, correct?
Yes. So I think when we were in lab last week, what I told you was that you'll discuss the proper process for donning and doffing. That's why I encouraged you guys to take a picture of the instructions and talk about where you struggled and where you're going to improve that appropriate donning and doffing process. Waste bag, there will be a couple of questions that I'll update, since it looks like Christy did it slightly different than I had planned, but that is fine. You guys still all got to practice the J seal, right? All right, yeah, I'll get those updated. And then you guys will have those 2 parts for one lab report on our RAD PPE. Just as a reminder for anybody who did want to apply to go on that trip to Chernobyl, I need those applications today by close of business. It's looking like the scholarship will cover all of the cost of registration. So you would really only be responsible for your airfare, even though that is still significant. It looks like tickets are about $1,500. So just be aware. All right, guys, any other questions?
I had a question about that. So it said that in order to like officially apply, we have to have a current passport. What if we don't have one? Can we still apply or no?
So by the 15th of this month, I have to give all the travel information to the organizers so that they can get our work permits from Ukraine to go to the power plant. And because the window is so short and the Department of State is not rush processing passports, if you don't have one by that date, you probably won't be able to get one in time for the trip. So, I mean, unless you're willing to spend the $400 or $500 with a courier service to get one expedited, that's the only way you can get one right now, because so many of the passport processing centers are not staffed. They're working from home because they're in places like DC and New York where COVID is still really growing. So I probably won't be able to go if you don't have a current passport.
Okay, no problem. I'll just wait till next year.
We could share mine, Doug.
Just change our last names.
Very effective.
Thank you, Mackenzie.
Yep, no problem. All right, I'll see you guys later.
Bye.
Thank you.
You're welcome.